I'm clean, thank you.
Good.
Okay.
Alrighty. So today we're going to talk about curves, sewing curves. And just so that I see it, show it, say it on the recording, the actual sewing of the seam is not that different than sewing a straight seam. You just have to, as you're sewing it, you have to use this hand and adjust the curve. Use your front hand and adjust the curve a little more and maybe kind of edge it into a curve because it wants to go in a straight line. And so you'll just have to, you'll have to slow down a little bit on the sewing. But as beginners, you're probably going to be sewing fairly slowly anyway. And just make sure you adjust it as you're going. What you will need to do, the biggest problem with curves is, depending on what kind of curve, it's how you pin them together and how you treat them and iron them afterward or press them. Because remember, I showed how you sew the seam and then you press the seam allowances open and flat. Well, if you have a curved seam, obviously these are not going to want to iron flat when it's a curved seam like that. So we've got to do something what we call clipping the curves. And then you can iron these on a regular ironing board, but you also might want to invest if you're going to do a lot of curves, which if you're going to be sewing bodices, the top of like shirts and bodices where they're fitted, you might want to invest in a special pressing tool called a pressing ham. And I am going to share my screen here. And this is what a pressing ham looks like. It is a firm stuffed object that has curves on it that you can press on top of instead of flat on your ironing board. I meant to actually bring mine today, and I had it sitting beside my, oh, Michonne's left. She had something to do. Okay, I had it sitting beside my purse, but I forgot it. So I have to show you a picture. It's not absolutely necessary. It just makes it easier if you're going to do a lot of curves sewing. So we've got, I'm going to,
Thinking that sometimes is on the ironing board to iron sleeves.
You can get ones that are sleeves. For sleeves, you can get a small skinny ironing board that's flat, or you can get one.
No, I mean sometimes ironing boards come with the additional tool to iron sleeves. Can that be used for pressing? It's flat enough.
It's flat and it's meant to go inside because most sleeve seams are flat. They're not curved. So it's just meant to be, it's just flat and skinny so that it will fit inside there so that you can iron the seams open. These are specifically rounded so that you can lay the seam on top like this and iron it around the top. And yeah. So I'm going to be talking about different kinds of curves. So this is what we call an inside curve. It's going, you're working on the inside part of the curve. There's also an outside curve. And there's ones where you have to fit an inside curve to an outside curve. This is the tricky one. This is especially the kind of thing you would do, let's say right here, because how it curves here. Well, this part for, we call that princess seam, those seams that start here and they go down here and then they straighten out. This part is actually curved outward and this part's curved inward. And they're just at different dimensions. So this one would be curved just slightly and this one would be curved a lot. And then when you sew the two together and try and open it out, it makes a curve shape that goes around the bust point. And so I'll talk about how to do that too. So let me talk about sewing here. Okay. I'm going to switch to my phone's mic. Be right back. Okay. Hold on, I'm gonna trying to get Oh, I know what I needed to do. Okay, so all right. So I'm gonna have to keep looking back because my monitor is behind me. Tighten this up. Okay. So when I sew this, these like this, where they're both curved outward or both curved inward, are not that difficult. They're pinned the same way as a regular seam does. But when one is curved outward and one is curved inward, you have to pin them slightly differently. Now, when you have a pattern that fits together, you will have little triangles built into it. We call these notches. And when you cut them, you will cut them so that the notches are outward. So when I cut this, whereas the triangle goes inward, I will cut the notches in the pattern outward. This is just to tell me where I'm going to line up. Notches are to line up your material. And sorry,
do you line up pattern and material flash, or you make a little allowance?
Let me get my headphones back.
I'm sorry.
Do I line up what?
The pattern and the material. You make a little allowance, right?
Technology, sorry.
Material
and your pattern will have the notches marked, and you just put the pattern down onto it and cut out around it.
No, I was talking about the side, the distance between the pattern and the edge of the material.
Oh, your pattern will have the built-in. I just didn't have pattern, so I had to create my own seam allowances with this. But when you do a pattern, it'll be built in. Okay. I'm still getting that weird echo thing, so I'm having to set my earphones aside for a second. Okay, so now normally what I would do is I would put them face to face. However, when one's curved outward and one's curved inward, this is a little problematic. This is where the notches come in. And let me get, usually your notches will be along your major points, like the bust point or the major point of the curve. And they will be the same distance apart. So I have 2 notches here and I have 2 notches here. So I'll want to line up the notches, and I'll want to pin one of the notches first. Then I'll want to pin the other notches. Okay, now you see how it's not wanting to go smoothly together? I will try to get it as smooth as I can, but if one is really curved and the other is really straight, the one that is pulling tight, you may have to clip. And usually it's the one that's cut inward. So in this case, I will cut the brown one. And I will just kind of snip, not all the way through the seam allowance, just about 1/4 of an inch, just enough to let that fabric spread a little bit so that then I can smoothly put them together. And one of them is not pulling the other one out of alignment. And I'll usually do that about every inch or so. Okay. And then you'll want to do that same thing. You should be able to line up the end of your seam. Now, if you have a pattern that has a point like this, and you have a seam here and a seam allowance here, you will have part that's going to stick out. So if I lined up the edges, that point would actually stick out like this when I did the fabric together. Because a lot of times when you get patterns, they don't bother cutting it off here because then you might sew too close to the edge or to the point. So they just continue on here. So here's actually where my seam allowances are going to go. But the fabric sticks out here. So if I'm going to line this up, this is going to line up like this, and you'll have a little extra sticking out. So if you are sewing some sort of pattern together and one of them has a point like this, be aware that that point's probably going to stick out, and don't try to line it up right to the end of that point. The way it lines up should be so that the seam allowances will hit perfectly in that right to the edge of the point, to the wherever this part ends. That's usually where it will line up, but you will have a little bit sticking out.
Do you cut it off afterwards?
Do
you cut it off afterwards, the part that sticks out?
You can. Most of the time, it's not necessary. So I'm going to finish lining this one up. Actually, I'm going to do this side because I don't need that end. This is the side I'm going to do first because I'm going to start on this end. And I'm going to need to clip that just a little bit. And the more curved your section is, the more you're going to have to clip. So if you've got one that's really straight and one that's really curved, or one that's really curved inward and one that's really curved outward, you may have to clip a little bit for closer together than 1 inch. And also, you know what I'm going to do is I am going to flip this over, and I am going to put the pins on this side so that the part I had to clip is on top. The reason I've decided to do this is because the part underneath is the part that's bigger. And the part here is what I have to clip to make it, to spread it. Well, anytime you have a little extra fabric, you always want to try and put that on the bottom, because your feed dogs will actually grab that a little bit more and will actually pull it and actually help gather up that extra fabric as you sew. So I'm going to switch my pins around. And so you see, it's a lot of adjustment. You don't have to, if you've pinned it one way, you don't have to keep it that way and say, oh, I pinned it upside down or whatever. You know, I pinned the pins are on the wrong side. Put the pins on the other side. When you go to sew and you realize, oh, my pins are scraping along the bottom. Okay, so this is where I've got it pinned. See, that side's a little smoother. This side's a little bunched up. And then I'm gonna take my thing over to my sewing machine, the other clamp here, and I'm gonna sew. All right, so as I'm doing this, I'm going to sew it just like I did before with the straight stitching. 1, 2, 1, 2, and as I go along. Now, if you've got fabric over here that's bunched up, that's not laying nice and flat, you have to be careful not to let that fabric bunch up along where you're sewing, because you will kind of catch that up in the seam, and then you'll have to rip the stitches out. So make sure you use your left hand to flatten as you go along. I'm going to sew this, and as I'm going, I am just kind of easing it along into the right position, so that the part that is underneath the presser foot is always straight. The part in front is going to curve off to the side. The part in the back may curve off to the side, but the part right under your presser foot is always going to be straight. That's the only part you care about. I'm sewing this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, just because it's being easier for me. Now, I'm getting up to a part where I want to show you. See how this part is wanting to bunch up as I'm sewing? I will need to take this and adjust this top layer of fabric so that that is smoothed out and it won't bunch up as much as I'm sewing. So you can adjust this top layer of your fabric so that right by your presser foot it's smooth. And I pinned close to the edge because I'm only doing a 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you're doing a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you might want to pin a little farther away from the edge, because you want wherever you want your seam allowance is going to be, you want to make sure you pin right around that seam allowance, just to keep the fabric flat in that area. It will help. So, and when we get to the end here, I do a couple of back stitches and then I continue forward off the edge. And I will, fix that. Okay. So now, when I go to press this open, This one is mostly flat, because I think most of the inside and outside curves are mostly similar curves. So I will have to, I can just like sew this flat if I need to. But I may actually, if I'm trying to iron it open and it's bunching in some parts, I may have to go through and clip a little closer down to the seam, toward the seam, not all the way up to the stitching, but pretty close. And I'm going to want to do that about every inch or so wherever there's a curve. And if it straightens out, you don't need to worry about that part. Okay. Then you'll come over and you'll iron or press it flat. Okay. So now this one is not going to be too difficult to press. Now it's a little bit because the curves are not quite exactly the same. So this one has a little bit of a cup to it. So I can iron this open. Now remember what I said about your fingers.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to be putting your fingers down, tilt your iron downward so that the steam comes up the back before you put it down there. And you may have to use your fingers and press these. That's what they call finger pressing. Just kind of opening it out and flattening it with your fingers for a couple of inches before you do this. Because of that clipping, you can't just run your finger along it like you could the other and open it all out, because each section is going to have to be flattened individually. So you may have to put your iron or open it out, put your iron, open it out, iron it, that kind of thing. And then you'll want to do it from this side. Now, if you have a pressing ham, it's going to have a curve that you can just put it around there. It's going to be like rounded, and you can just use your pressing ham and your iron and press it into the curve. If you don't have that, you may have to, I don't know if you can see what I'm doing with my hands. I'm lifting this part up and using the tip of my iron to iron into it so that I'm not trying and flattening this part here. I'm basically ironing with the tip and lifting this up so that I get that curve in there. You can also do it on the part of your ironing board with that at the front where it's got a kind of a corner to it. You can also iron it over the corners. And let me move this so that it's down near the corner. So you can actually, if you need to, you can actually iron it around the corner of your ironing board like this to get that curve in there. That's one of the reasons why your ironing board is shaped the way it is and why it has curved corners, so that you can iron or press the rounded edges into it if you don't have a tailor's ham, and that you have different angles on the ironing board. You have a rather tight angle corner here that you can iron around. When you get up near this part, you've got a wider curve that you can iron around. And then here's rounded, but not as cornered as the other one. So between those three sections, you can actually iron around there without having a pressing hand. And that will help. Now, if you are going to be ironing, you're going to be sewing something like this and then turning it inside out, like let's say a pillow. You're going to be doing a round pillow. You want it face together, and you're going to want to sew the edges. And I'm going to do this one a 5/8 inch just because you're going to be doing 5/8 inches. And this is a sharper curve. But I'm always, I don't worry about this part here. I don't worry about the part in the back. I'm always worried about this part right here next to the presser foot. And this part on this side. This part here, to the left and right here, that's what you need to focus on. And that's the part you need to adjust. And if it's too much of an angle, you can always do a little bit of that thing where I showed you about corners. You can stop with the needle down and lift the presser foot up just a little and adjust it if you're finding that you're not getting it quite. If you do that, what you're probably doing is going a little too fast. Okay. Now I've got that part done. Now in the other one, because I was sewing it, I was opening this out and sewing it flat. All I had to do was clip. And that released enough of the fabric to get it flat. And that's all I worried about. In this one, I'm going to be turning it inside out. And I'm going to be turning it like this. So in this case, we're going to have to deal with what we dealt with in the mask, which is all that bunched up fabric inside that. Okay, so we're actually going to need to do like we, on the mask, we clipped off the fabric along the corners so that it didn't bunch up. Well, when we do a curve like this, and we're going to be turning it inside, right side out like this, we're going to need to clip some of that fabric out of there so it doesn't bunch up. So in that case, it's not enough to just snip. You actually have to cut little notches into it, like every inch or so. See what I'm doing there? Mm-hmm. And you only need to do this where the curves are, where it's curved. And see, this is the part where I didn't go around the curve smoothly and I had to adjust it. This is why you don't want to, this is why you want to do it smoothly and not have to pick up the presser foot, because you'll end up with little kind of uneven wobbly seams. Okay. What this does is it not only cuts those notches, but it also cuts down on the bulk inside, so that now those notches that are open like this, when you turn them right side out, those notches will close together and you'll be able to iron this flat or press this flat without having a bunch of bulky, ripply stuff inside it. So that's pretty much the most important parts to remember. Is if you've got one you're going to open up flat, you really only have to flip the ones that are going to be spreading apart. And if you're finding a little too much bulk in this side, you might want to take the notch. You might want to notch it a little bit on the side that you find too much bulk in. So if it's tugging, clip it. If it's bunching, take a notch. But it's not as big a deal on this one that's flat because they'll just slide over each other. But on this one where you have to actually turn it right side out, and all that fabric's going to be bunched up, double layered inside, that's when you need to make sure you notch it and cut out some of the bulk. And in this case, when I went to press it, I would do what I did with the mask last week, which is, excuse me, I would flatten it first. And this step where you flatten it first, that sets the stitches down inside and makes it a little extra secure. Then you flip it inside out. And you might want to take something and run along the inside, like I use my brush, my little paintbrush, and kind of flatten and get the edges all turned out nice and neatly. And then press it downward. So if you want to do, let's say, a round pillow, you would do it just like you did the mask last week. You would start with two circles face to face, pin and sew and leave a gap of about like this much. Then you'll want to clip the corners or clip the seam allowances and cut notches like we did here. Fit inside out, iron it. Then you'll have this much open, and then you'll put the stuffing in there. You'll buy a bag of fiberfill. This is a brand name, Polyfill. It's just like stuffing, and you stuff it in there. And then you would kind of flip the part in that you had open, like we did with the mask last week. You take the opening and kind of tuck the edges down inside. And if it's stuffed, you then can't iron, you can't press it closed because, it's got a bunch of stuffing. In that case, you would pin it closed and then either sew it with the machine, or if you want it to be unobtrusive, take a needle and thread and sew the opening closed. And then you've got your pillow. All right. So the most important thing is pinning properly, clipping both before and after you sew, depending on what's happening, and lining up notches if you're using a pattern. All right, I'm going to switch over to
can't hear you, Cheryl.
All right. Is that it? Can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
For some reason, whenever I turn the mic off on my headset and then I come back to it, it doesn't want to pick up again, so I have to switch to my webcam mic. Okay, so the actual lesson today is not as long as the other ones, but it is very, very important if you're going to be sewing clothing, most specifically anything fitted. Loose fabric can be gotten away with. You can get away with straight lines, like tunic tops and like A-line skirts and things like that. You can get away with not sewing curves. But if you're going to do anything that's fitted, a fitted skirt will have a curve around the hip. Pants will have a curve around the crotch. And bodices will have curves around the breast area, usually along the side if the waist is nipped in, and sometimes around the back. If you're doing like princess seams, which are the kind like this, that are like right here, that's a princess seam. Okay. All right, and I think I wanted to talk a little bit about hems. I know that wasn't part of the thing, but the listing, but since we only used like 45 minutes on the curves, I thought we might also want to touch on hems really quickly. Does anybody have any questions about curves? Hi.
You're wonderful. You are a miracle worker.
I've just been doing this for 35 years. 35 years. Okay. Oh, maybe a little more than that, 37. Yeah. Okay. So, hems. I'm going to move my...
What's the difference between hem and seam?
A seam is where any two pieces of fabric join together.
Mm-hmm.
A hem is at the edge, where you want a finished edge. Okay. So let me flip back to my camera. Okay. Now I have my head set off again. So once again, if you need to talk to me, get my attention, and I'll put my headset back on. Okay. So when it comes to a small hem, a lot of people will just say, okay, so you want to fold this over twice. And I'm going to turn this volume down. I'm still getting an echo. Okay. When you're doing a hem, you want to enclose it. You want to enclose the raw edges so they don't ravel. So it's not enough just to fold it up once. You need to fold it up twice so that the raw edge is encased inside there so that it's not going to ravel on you in the washing machine. Okay. Now, a lot of people will just fold that over twice and start sewing it. But remember what I said about the feed dogs pulling and shifting the fabric? If you do that, you will get a nice, even, you'll get a good hem. But the first time you wash it, you'll find out, you'll get those little skewies on the edge. I don't know if you've ever seen for women, if you've had a cotton skirt that the first time you washed it, you got little kind of ripples in the edge of the hem and you had to iron it flat again. That's because they did not iron it before they sewed it. To get a nice professional result in your hems, you press the hems into the fabric before you sew them. Let me get where my canvas very, there we go. Okay. So you want to go through and you'll want to press it up, usually 1/4 of an inch. And then you'll want to press it up again. And then you will want to pin it. You may be tempted to skip this step, but if you want a nice professional result, you will not skip this step. Now, if you're doing a small hem, like on the edge of a sleeve or something, these may be very skinny. If you're doing a hem on the edge of a shirt, that second step may actually be wider like this. If you're doing a hem on the end of a skirt, they may actually have it built into where it's like 2 inches. And you may be like, well, why can't I just do a hem like this or even this on the bottom of a skirt? Why do I need a big wide hem? The more fabric that is at the hem, the nicer the skirt will fall. It will be a little bit more weighted at the bottom, and it will bring it down more smoothly. Okay. And then what I will do is I'm going to cut this extra piece off because it's kind of acting there. That's more like what a hem would look like, not with that little piece sticking out. Okay, so then I would sew with my stitching right along here, like we did the top stitching with the mask, except instead of this edge, I'm going to sew right here along about 1/8 of an inch in from this edge. This is the point where you need your bobbin thread to be really nicely matching your fabric, or at least pretty close. Like I said, you don't have to match your thread exactly, but close enough so that it's not going to be obvious. Because frankly, nobody's going to get down on their knees and look at your hem and go, your thread was 2 shades lighter than your fabric. Oh no, they're not going to see. They're not going to bother with that. Okay. So when you do this, and when you're doing it on a curve, and I'll talk about curved hems too. You know what? Let me go ahead and cut a curve into this fabric, and I'll talk to you about curved hems. Most curved hems are not really tight curves, but you do have to, let me go back to the ironing board. Okay. When you do a curved hem, let's say you're doing a circle skirt or something like that, you can't just fold it up and then fold it up again, because then by the time you get to this edge, you're going to be doing a straight line instead of the curve. you have to actually ease this in a little bit. As we do the curve, you're going to iron it a little bit and go around the curve, and you're actually going to press some little puckers into it. Okay, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this. This is called easing it in while you iron. And you may actually even get little puckers where the fabric is too much fabric there. And then you're going to do it again. And most of the time when you have a curved hem, you're going to have skinny hems. You won't have a big wide hem on curved hems because the more fabric you turn up, the more it's going to pucker. So this part about the pressing is very, very, very important when it comes to curved hems. And you're going to kind of steam it a little bit before you push it down. And you may actually get little pointy things, and I'll show you where I had to iron a little pucker into it. I don't know if you can see that.
Can you cut it?
I had to iron a little pucker right into that fabric. So that the outside was nice and smooth. If you've got a curved hem and you want a nice wide hem on it for the way it falls, what you should do in that case is actually cut out a piece, use your skirt pattern, and take the bottom of it and cut a piece of fabric the same shape as your hem, about that wide, and actually sew that in place instead of folding this up. So that you actually have two pieces that are like this. And then you'll have to sew the top of your, let's say this is the inside. I know black is not good for this, but so you'll have one piece that's about a couple inches wide sewn down on top of the actual fabric on the inside. Oh, and also curved hems. If you have a curved hem, in the first or second class, I told you about, or second class, I told you about straight of the grain and bias. And remember, when it's cut on the bias or not straight across, it stretches a little. When you have a curved hem, part of that curve is not going to be on the straight of the grain simply because it's a curve. When that happens, part of that will stretch a little bit more than others. So if you have a curved hem on a skirt, before you sew the hem, sew everything else and leave the hem to last. Then hang that skirt up on a hanger for 24 hours. And then part of it you may find will stretch a little bit more. And that part you can actually, you'll then measure to see if any part of it stretched, measure from the waistband and see if any part of it stretched. And if any part of it stretched, trim the hem at that point back so that it's even. Otherwise, the edges of your skirt or parts of your skirt where it's on the curve may have stretched and your hem may be a little wavy. So if you have a curved hem, always hang it up for 24 hours and then measure from the waist to see if any of it's stretched and trim it off. Okay. So for hems, the most normal kind is just to, as I said, if it's a straight hem, sew it top stitch right along that part. You'll still want to do the 1, 2, and then back. And I'm going to just pretend I did the whole thing. Okay. And the outside will look like that. And the inside will look like this. And you will have caught those raw edges inside the hem. Now, your sewing machine, if it has different stitches, may actually have a blind hem stitch, which is this one. This is what you would do if you don't like the look of the stitching on the outside and you want to try and minimize the stitching on the outside. This is called a blind hem stitch. And how that works is it will take a stitch or two, and then it will jump over for one stitch, and then it will stitch another, then it will jump over and do that again. How this is used, what you do is you iron your fabric, your thing, your hem, just like we did before, but you want to kind of fold it over and you're going to look at the inside of it. And you're going to sew it like this. So do you see what I did? This is my hem. I folded it over a little bit, and then I folded it over again, and I pinned it. Now I'm just going to take that hem part, and I'm just going to flip it to the back. And I want to stitch just along this inside part here, so that every once in a while when it goes over, it catches this and then comes back, stitches here, catches, stitches, goes to the left, catches, stitches, so that the only thing that shows on the outside is when it comes over and catches this part. That's the only thing that shows on the outside. Okay. And you want to try and adjust it so that it just barely catches it. Now let me see if I can come up closer and see if you can see this as I'm stitching. So let's see. And you want to practice this with a regular fabric to see how far your machine stitches. This one doesn't have any width adjustment on this machine, so I'm not exactly sure how far over it goes. I'm just going to manually crank it 1 or 2 stitches and see how far over it goes. Okay. And I'm going to adjust it. Let me see if I can, so that the needle just barely catches that outside fabric. See how it is? It just barely catches it. And see, it's taking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's going over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going over. And I will always want to go back and I'm going to back stitch at the end of this one too. Okay. And I'm going to take my pins out. And then you're going to iron this flat. And now you'll see the difference between these two stitches. Okay, I'll see if I can get you. Okay, this is the regular stitch. And this is the blind hem stitch. See how it only has stitches every, this one you see the whole line of stitches. This one you see a stitch like every inch, like there, there, and there. And if you've matched, if your thread is even anywhere close to your fabric, that will be much more unobtrusive. And that's called a blind hem stitch. This is especially useful if your fabric has different colors on it. Because if you're using rainbow fabric, you may use blue that matches one part of the fabric, but then when you get to the pink part of the fabric, it's should be really obvious. So if you want have a bunch of different colors along the hem and you want to make the stitching less obvious, you do the blind hem stitch by flipping it over and doing it that way. And most machines that have different stitches will have that. And then you will iron it flat from the outside to make sure that there's no puckering or anything, and get any wrinkles out. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my headset. Okay. Can you guys hear me this time? Okay, great.
Yep.
All righty. So, what else is there about hems? Oh, I'm going to turn that thing off of that one. If you are doing sleeves, since we were talking about sleeves earlier, hem on a sleeve, your machine might have a little part by the presser foot. Your machine might have a part that slides out. These don't. This one doesn't. But if your machine, my machine at home does, if your machine has a part that slides on and off, it will slide off so that you can more easily get into narrow places like the end of sleeves. If you are doing, actually, I'm going to have to turn my camera back on, or I'm going to have to turn my thing back on here. If you are doing sleeves, and let's say you have a very narrow opening, and I'm just going to pin, I'm going to pin this into an opening and pretend that it's a sleeve. Okay, let's say this is a sleeve, very narrow opening. It's kind of hard to sew. The easiest way to sew it is not on the outside. Normally we sew on the outside, but with a sleeve, since there's a bunch of little fabric here, if I try and sew this way, This fabric under here on the back side may pull up and get caught in that seam as I'm doing the hem of the sleeve. So for sleeves and cuffs, when you do the hem, you probably want to make sure you want to go on the inside of the sleeve so that your sleeve opening is like this, and you're working on the inside. That way you can see where this extra fabric is, and you can use this hand to kind of catch it and pull it open and pull it out of the way. When you do that, you're going to have to, it's going to be very tight, and you're going to sometimes you're like a small opening just like this, and you'll have to be very extra careful to stick your fingers in that opening and make sure that the fabric doesn't come down and get caught in the seam allowance, or in the stitching, sorry. So when you're working on a small opening, don't work on the outside of the opening. Work on the inside of the opening so that this hand can pull this fabric out of the way. And you'll have to adjust it like every inch or so. You'll have to adjust the fabric and maybe flip it, because the fabric over here, if you're going in a small circle, small opening, it's going to twist that fabric on the left-hand side. So you'll have to, as you do that, you'll have to take your hand, and you'll have to like grab that fabric, that bunch of fabric over there on the left, and flip it so that it doesn't get all twisted like a dish rag. All right, does anybody have any questions about curves or hems?
Could you show us an example of that part that slides down that you can put your sleeve on to sew?
Oh, I don't have it on this machine. Let me see if I can find you a picture of one online. Yeah, let me, give me just a second. I'm doing a search here. Okay. All right, here's one. Let me share my screen. Okay, so see how this machine is? This part actually slides off. And you just pull it to the side and it snaps off. And then you have a smaller opening. If you have one of these, then you can work on, whoops, I beg your pardon. I accidentally hit the mouse button. If you have one of these, then you can work on the outside of the sleeve, because your fabric is going to go, your fabric's going to slip right onto that skinny part, and it's a little bit easier. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, of course, not every machine has it. This one I'm working on now doesn't. But if you buy one, you may wonder why that part slides off and on like that. That's why. So you can work on sleeves a little bit easier. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so that's the end of our first 4 sessions of our sewing series. Now I'm going to be having, for the foreseeable future, I'm going to be having 1 session a month on various topics, and I'm going to be doing. We're going to have a couple weeks off, and then I'm going to be doing
on the third Tuesday of the month. So that would be, the next one would be the February the 16th. I'm going to be doing another session and on different topics. And the next one is going to be patterns. What are the markings on the patterns are, how to read a pattern, different tips and tricks, and pattern sizing. Oh, for one thing, patterns, you may be a size 12, but that doesn't mean you're a size 12 in sewing patterns. If you're a size 12 in regular clothes, you're probably a size 16 in sewing patterns. So, you know, and sewing patterns have a certain amount of what we call ease built in. If you sewed a garment that was exactly the same size as your measurements, it would be skin tight, literally, because you're measuring the size of your skin, you know, and you wouldn't be able to move in it. So each sewing pattern has a certain amount of ease. They call it wearing ease built in. So there'll be like at least an inch around the bust, at least half an inch around the waist, at least an inch around the hips, that kind of thing, so that you can move in the fabric, in the garment. And different patterns have different amount of ease built into them. And the major 4 sewing patterns, Simplicity, McCall, Butterick, and Vogue, are notorious, especially Simplicity, McCall, and Butterick, because they're all owned by the same company, are notorious for making patterns that are too loose, because they assume Americans want very loose and gigantic clothing. So especially if you're going to be wearing or making fitted clothing that you want to fit snugly, you will actually need to not even take their word for what size you are. You will actually need to measure the pattern pieces and do math, unfortunately. Okay, and the sessions after that, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be doing in March, but I will also be doing just question answering sessions for problems that you've run into as you learn to sew. So there may be sessions on tips and tricks, or just you know, what questions or where you're having problems, and I'll be your problem solver. Okay. All right, and these will have different. I'm gonna have to give those a different
Name?
Zoom link, because when I'm doing a Zoom link, I can only have one. If they're recurring, I can only have one distance apart, I guess. And so these will be every week, but from now on, they'll be every month. So those going forward will have a different link. So you won't be able to use the link you used for today's class going forward. But I am going to be putting it up on the library calendar. You should get the link that way, just like you registered for one of these. And it doesn't matter which one you register for. Going forward, if they're a month apart, they'll be the same link. Okay. All right, and it's about 1:45, so
Thanks again.
see you guys
Thank
next
you.
time.
Appreciate it.
Bye.